She left food for a shadow in the woods every winter, never knowing what took it. The night a massive Bigfoot collapsed bleeding at her door, she made a choice that changed everything. What she didn't know. Saving his life would make her the only human standing between his hidden people and total extinction. The deer stew had gone cold an hour ago. Clara stood at her kitchen window, watching the snow fall in thick, silent sheets across the mountain. The cabin groaned under the weight of winter, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, something was watching her back. She knew because the food was always gone by morning. Started 3 winters ago, right after Thomas died. She'd made too much soup, enough for 2, and couldn't bear to throw it away. So she'd left it outside on the porch in a tin bowl, thinking maybe a fox or a bear would find it. By dawn, the bowl was licked clean and placed neatly beside the door. Not dragged away, not scattered, placed. That's when she knew it wasn't an animal. At least, not the kind most people believed in. Tonight, the storm was worse than any she'd seen. The wind screamed through the pines, and the temperature had dropped so fast that ice formed on the inside of her windows. Clara ladled the leftover stew into the same dented bowl and pulled on Thomas's old coat. Still too big for her, still smelling faintly of wood smoke and old spice. She opened the door, and the cold hit her like a fist. The porch was buried under a foot of fresh powder. She waded through it, set the bowl down on the top step, and turned to go back inside when she heard it. Crack. A branch snapping. Close. Too close. Clara froze, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She squinted into the tree-line, barely visible through the swirling snow. First, she saw nothing. Then the shadow moved. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, and it walked upright like a man. But the shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, and when it stepped into a patch of moonlight breaking through the clouds, Clara saw thick, dark fur covering its entire body. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The creature limped badly, dragging its left leg. One arm clutched its side, and even from 30 feet away, Clara could see the way it swayed, unsteady, like it might collapse at any moment. It stopped at the edge of the clearing. For a long, breathless moment, they stared at each other. Clara should have run, should have screamed, should have grabbed Thomas's rifle from above the mantel and fired a warning shot into the air. But she didn't, because the creature's eyes, huge and amber, glowing faintly in the dark, weren't filled with rage or hunger. They were filled with pain. It took one cautious step forward, then another. Its breathing was labored, rattling in its chest like broken glass. When it reached the porch steps, it bent down slowly, so slowly, and picked up the bowl with hands that looked almost human, except for the black claws and the sheer size of them. It lifted the bowl to its mouth and drank. Clara pressed herself against the doorframe, too terrified to move, too stunned to look away. The creature finished the stew in 3 long gulps, then set the bowl down gently, just like always. That's when it looked up at her. Their eyes met, and Clara felt something shift in the air between them. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. The creature nodded, an unmistakably human gesture, and turned to leave. But as it limped back toward the trees, Clara saw it. Blood. Dark red droplets in the snow, trailing behind it like breadcrumbs. "Wait," she whispered, though she had no idea why. The creature paused, glancing back over its massive shoulder. Clara's mouth went dry. "You're hurt." It stared at her for 3 long seconds, then continued into the forest, swallowed by the darkness and the storm. Clara stood on the porch until her fingers went numb, staring at the blood-stained snow. When she finally went inside, she locked the door, poured herself a shaking glass of whiskey, and sat by the fire until dawn. She didn't sleep. By morning, the storm had worsened. The world outside was a wall of white, and the thermometer on the porch read 12 below zero. Clara pulled on her boots and coat and stepped outside to retrieve the bowl. The blood trail was still there, already half buried under fresh snow but unmistakable. It led into the forest, winding between the trees, and Clara found herself following it without thinking. She should have stayed inside, should have called someone, though who would believe her? But Thomas used to say she had too much heart and not enough sense, and maybe he was right. The trail led her 100 yards into the woods before it stopped. There, slumped against the trunk of a massive pine, was the creature. It wasn't moving. Clara's breath caught. She crept closer, her boots crunching in the snow, and that's when she saw the wound. A deep gash across its ribs, still bleeding, surrounded by bruised and matted fur. "Oh God!" she whispered. The creature's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, they just stared at each other again. Then, slowly, it raised one trembling hand toward her. Not in threat, but in something that looked almost like pleading. Clara made a decision that would change everything. "Okay," she said quietly, kneeling in the snow. "Okay, let me help you." The creature's hand dropped, and its eyes closed again. Clara ran back to the cabin, grabbed a sled she used for hauling firewood, and returned to the forest. It took every ounce of strength she had, and possibly a miracle, to roll the creature onto the sled. He had to weigh 500 pounds, maybe more, but somehow, step by agonizing step, she dragged him back through the snow, across the clearing, and into the barn beside her cabin. The sun was rising by the time she got him inside, and Clara was shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. She'd just brought a Bigfoot into her barn, and now she had to figure out how to keep him alive. The barn smelled like hay and motor oil and something wild Clara couldn't name. She hung 2 lanterns from the rafters, flooding the space with amber light. The creature lay motionless on a bed of horse blankets, his chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular breaths. Up close, he was even more enormous than she'd realized. His shoulders were as wide as her kitchen table, and his hands could easily palm a basketball. Clara rolled up her sleeves and tried to remember everything Thomas had taught her about field medicine. "Don't die on me," she muttered, dragging her first aid kit closer. "I didn't haul 500 pounds of cryptid through a blizzard just to have you die in my barn." She peeled away the matted fur around the wound. The gash was deep, 6 inches long, cutting down to the muscle. Whatever had attacked him had meant to kill. The creature's eyes snapped open. Clara jerked back, her heart hammering. Those amber eyes locked onto hers, alert and aware, studying her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. "I'm trying to help you," she said softly, holding up the needle and thread. "This is going to hurt." He watched her for a long moment. Then, impossibly, he gave a small nod. Clara's hands trembled as she threaded the needle. She'd stitched up Thomas once after he'd fallen off the roof, but this was different. This was a creature that shouldn't exist, lying vulnerable in her barn, trusting her not to hurt him. She pressed the needle to his skin. He didn't flinch. For 20 minutes, Clara worked in concentrated silence, pulling the wound closed stitch by careful stitch. The creature never made a sound, though she could feel the tension in his massive frame, see the way his claws dug into the dirt floor. When she finally tied off the last stitch and sat back, her shoulders aching, the creature released a long, shuddering breath. "There," Clara whispered. "You're going to be okay." He turned his head to look at the wound, then back at her. His expression, if she could call it that, seemed almost grateful. Clara cleaned her hands on a rag and stood. "I'll bring you water, and more food. You need to rest." She was halfway to the door when she heard it. "Clara!" She froze, her blood turning to ice. Slowly, she turned around. The creature was watching her, his massive chest rumbling with effort. "Clara," he said again, the syllables thick and awkward in his throat, but unmistakable. Her name. He'd just said her name. "You can talk," she breathed. He shook his head slightly, then tapped his temple with one clawed finger. He pointed at her, then at himself, then touched his chest. "I understand. I listen." "You've been listening to me?" Clara said, her mind reeling. "All those nights I talked to myself on the porch. You heard me." Another nod. For 3 years, she'd stood on that porch after leaving food, talking to the darkness about Thomas, about the loneliness, about the long winters that never seemed to end. She thought she was alone, but she never had been. Tears stung her eyes. "What's your name?" He tilted his head, considering. Then he made a sound. A deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in her bones. It sounded like Kale, or close enough. Kale, Clara repeated. His eyes brightened, and if she didn't know better, she'd swear he was smiling. By the second day, Kale could sit up. By the third, he was walking slowly, carefully, but walking nonetheless. Clara brought him venison stew, bread, and water, and watched in amazement as he ate with surprising delicacy for something with claws. In return, Kale helped however he could. When Clara went to chop wood, she found the entire pile already split and stacked neatly by the cabin. When she struggled to clear snow from the roof, Kale emerged from the barn and swept it clear with one massive arm. He moved through the forest like a ghost, silent despite his size, and twice Clara saw him standing at the treeline at night, perfectly still, watching for threats. On the fourth night, she woke to a sound she'd never heard before. Thud, 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 deep, rhythmic, shaking the floorboards beneath her feet. Clara grabbed her coat and rushed outside. Kale stood in the clearing, illuminated by moonlight, his massive fist pounding the frozen ground in a steady beat. Thud, thud, thud. The sound echoed across the valley, rolling through the mountains like distant thunder. And then, impossibly, the mountains answered back. A low rumble, coming from somewhere deep in the range. Miles away, but unmistakable. Kale stopped drumming. He tilted his head, listening, then turned to Clara. His expression was urgent. "What is it?" she asked. "What's wrong?" He gestured toward the mountains, then touched his chest, then pointed at her. "Come. You need to come with me." "Where?" Kale looked at her with those ancient amber eyes, and Clara understood. He was taking her home, to wherever he came from, to wherever others like him lived, hidden in these mountains, surviving against all odds. And something was wrong there, something that required help. Clara thought about the comfortable lie of her ordinary life, the safe boundaries of her small world. Then she thought about the creature who'd trusted her enough to let her save his life. "Okay," she said. "I'll follow you." Dawn came cold and pale, turning the snow blue. Clara packed a canvas rucksack with supplies. Rope, matches, a thermos of coffee, Thomas's old hunting knife. She had no idea where Kale was taking her or how long they'd be gone, but something in his urgency told her this couldn't wait. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her with patient intensity. "Lead the way," Clara said. Kale moved into the forest, and Clara followed. For hours, they traveled in silence through terrain she'd never seen despite living here for 8 years. Kale navigated effortlessly through the deep snow, occasionally glancing back to make sure she could keep up. Twice, he stopped to let her rest, and once he caught her when she stumbled on a hidden root beneath the powder. His hand was warm, she realized, warmer than any human's. By midday, they reached a ridge Clara didn't recognize. Below them stretched an untouched valley, the pine forest so dense it looked black against the white snow. Kale pointed down, then at himself, then made a sweeping gesture that seemed to encompass the entire valley. "Home. You live down there?" Clara asked. He nodded, but his expression darkened. He touched his wounded side, then pointed at the valley again and shook his head slowly. "Danger. Something's wrong." They descended carefully, Clara's legs burning with exhaustion. The trees grew thicker here, blocking out most of the daylight. Strange sounds echoed through the forest. Not birds or wind, but something else. Something that made the hair on Clara's neck stand up. Then she heard them. Wolves. A pack of them, their howls rising in harmony somewhere to the east. Kale stopped immediately, his massive frame going rigid. He sniffed the air, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "How many?" Clara whispered. Kale held up both hands twice. 20, maybe more. They emerged from the trees like gray ghosts, lean, hungry, and desperate. Their eyes glowed yellow in the shadows, fixed on Clara. The pack leader, a scarred male easily 100 pounds, stepped forward and bared its teeth. Clara reached for the knife at her belt. Kale stepped in front of her. He didn't roar or beat his chest. He simply stood there, 8 feet of raw power, and stared the alpha down. For 10 seconds, nothing moved. The forest held its breath. Then Kale raised one arm and brought his fist down on a fallen log beside him. The wood exploded like a bomb had hit it, splinters flying in every direction. The alpha wolf tucked its tail and retreated. The pack followed, melting back into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. Clara released a shaking breath. "Thank you." Kale turned and placed one massive hand gently on her shoulder. A gesture so human, so reassuring, that Clara felt tears prick her eyes. They reached the cabin just before sunset. Kale helped her gather firewood, his movements still careful around his stitched wound. While Clara prepared dinner, he sat outside and did that thing again, drumming his fist against the frozen earth in a slow, steady rhythm. Thud, thud, thud. This time, Clara put on her coat and joined him. "What does it mean?" she asked. "The drumming." Kale paused, thinking. He touched his chest over his heart, then pointed at the mountains. He made the drumming motion again. "Heartbeat. Connection. You're telling them you're alive," Clara said softly. "You're telling your family you're okay." Kale nodded. Then he took her hand, his palm easily twice the size of hers, and placed it flat against the ground. "What am I supposed to?" She felt it, a vibration, deep and rhythmic, traveling through the earth itself. Not from Kale's drumming, but from somewhere far away. An answer. The mountains were responding, and beneath the frozen soil, Clara could feel the pulse of something ancient and alive. "There are more of you," she breathed. "A lot more." Kale's eyes met hers, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. He stood abruptly and gestured for her to follow. They walked to the barn, where he began drawing in the dirt with one claw, crude pictures but clear enough. He drew mountains, then caves, then many figures like himself. Then he drew human figures with machines, digging into the mountains. Finally, he drew the caves collapsing, his people trapped inside. Clara's stomach dropped. "Someone's destroying your home." Kale nodded, his expression grim. "That's why you were injured. You were protecting them." Another nod. He pointed at her, then at himself, then at the drawing of the mountains. "I need you to see. I need you to understand." "When?" Clara asked. Kale looked toward the darkening sky. He held up one finger. "Tomorrow." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the wind howl around the cabin, thinking about what Kale had shown her, about the drums that spoke through the earth, about a species that shouldn't exist, hiding in the mountains, fighting for survival against threats they didn't deserve. She thought about Thomas, who'd always said the mountains held secrets worth protecting. And she thought about the choice she'd already made the moment she'd dragged Kale into her barn. Some things were bigger than fear. Some things were worth the risk. When dawn came, Clara was already dressed and waiting. Kale stood at her door, and in his eyes she saw both gratitude and urgency. It was time to see the truth. They left before sunrise, when the world was still painted in shades of gray and blue. Kale moved with purpose now, his wound healing faster than should have been possible. Clara struggled to keep pace as he led her deeper into the mountains, along paths that didn't exist on any map she'd ever seen. The snow fell harder with each passing hour, erasing their footprints almost as quickly as they made them. Clara's face burned with cold despite her scarf, and ice crystals formed on her eyelashes. She was about to ask for another rest when Kale stopped abruptly. They stood before a sheer rock face, dark stone jutting 50 feet into the air. It looked impassable. Kale placed his palm flat against the rock and pushed. Nothing happened. Then he drummed 3 slow beats, a pause, then 2 quick ones. The stone rumbled. Clara stumbled backward as a crack appeared in the rock face, barely visible, no wider than her shoulders. It looked like a natural fissure, the kind that could have been there for centuries without anyone noticing. But it hadn't been there a moment ago. Kale gestured for her to follow and slipped inside. Clara hesitated at the entrance, peering into the darkness. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to run home to her safe cabin and her ordinary life. Instead, she stepped into the crack. The passage was narrow and dark, forcing her to turn sideways in places. She could hear Cale ahead of her, his breathing echoing off the stone. The temperature dropped with each step, and soon she could see her breath forming clouds in the blackness. Then, gradually, the darkness began to lift. The walls were glowing. Clara pressed her hand against the stone and gasped. It was ice. Clear, pure ice embedded in the rock, and it pulsed with a faint blue-green light, like bioluminescent algae she'd once seen in a documentary about deep ocean creatures. "What is this?" she whispered. Cale touched the glowing ice gently, almost reverently. He made a sound, a low melodic hum, and the ice brightened in response. They walked for what felt like miles through those glowing tunnels, descending deeper into the mountain. The passage widened eventually, and Clara could stand upright again. The ice formations grew more elaborate, crystalline structures that branched across the ceiling like frozen trees, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And then she saw them, paintings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every surface. They were rendered in dark pigments, charcoal and rust-red ochre, and they told a story. Clara approached slowly, her hand outstretched. The first painting showed figures like Cale, living in harmony with the forest. They were painted alongside humans, both species hunting, gathering, coexisting. The next panel showed fire, massive flames consuming the forest, driving both humans and Cale's people from their homes. Then came the split. Humans rebuilt in the valleys. Cale's people retreated into the mountains, into caves, into hiding. The final paintings showed hunters, humans with guns and traps, hunting the creatures into the darkness. And then, nothing but empty forests and closed cave mouths. "You've been hiding for decades," Clara said, her voice breaking. "Because we hunted you." Cale stood beside her, staring at the paintings with ancient sadness in his eyes. He touched one image, a young creature being carried away by its mother, fleeing human hunters. Then he touched his own chest. "That's you," Clara realized. "You were that child." He nodded slowly. Clara felt something crack open inside her. Grief for what had been lost, shame for what her species had done, and a fierce, protective anger she hadn't felt since Thomas died. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Cale looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked her. He leaned down and pressed his forehead gently against hers. A gesture of forgiveness, of trust. When he pulled away, he gestured deeper into the tunnel. More to see. They walked for another 30 minutes, the glowing ice growing brighter as they descended. The air grew warmer too, and Clara heard something she didn't expect, the sound of running water. The tunnel opened abruptly, and Clara stopped dead. They stood on a ledge overlooking a vast underground valley. Steam rose from pools of crystal-clear water, fed by underground springs. Icicles the size of trees hung from the cavern ceiling hundreds of feet above, and the glowing ice created a perpetual twilight that bathed everything in ethereal blue light. And everywhere were Cale's people. Clara counted at least 50 of them. Some tended fires near the water pools. Others worked on what looked like woven shelters made from branches and moss. She saw children, smaller versions of Cale, playing and wrestling near the water. She saw elders, their fur gray and white, sitting in circles and making those deep humming sounds that seemed to resonate through the earth itself. It was a village, a hidden civilization that had survived in the darkness, away from human eyes, for generations. "It's beautiful," Clara breathed, but as she looked closer, she saw the cracks. Literally, fissures spider-webbed across the cavern ceiling. Chunks of ice and rock had fallen in places, crushing shelters and forcing the inhabitants to move. And in the distance, Clara could hear something that didn't belong. A deep, rhythmic pounding. Not the drumming of Cale's people. Machinery. Cale's expression darkened. He pointed upward, toward the cracked ceiling, and Clara understood. Someone was digging. Someone was drilling into the mountain directly above this hidden sanctuary. And they were going to bring the whole thing down. An elder approached them. A massive female with silver-streaked fur and eyes that looked like they'd witnessed centuries. She moved with dignified slowness, her footsteps silent despite her size. The other creatures parted respectfully as she passed. She stopped before Kale and made a series of low, rumbling sounds. Kale responded in kind, gesturing toward Clara. The elder's ancient gaze shifted to her, studying her with an intensity that made Clara feel like her soul was being weighed. Then the elder extended one weathered hand. Clara took it, and the elder's grip was surprisingly gentle. The elder made another sound, softer this time, and several of the younger creatures approached cautiously. Children, Clara realized, their eyes wide with curiosity. They'd probably never seen a human up close before. One brave youngling reached out and touched Clara's hair, then jumped back in surprise. The others chittered with what could only be laughter. Despite everything, Clara smiled. Kale led her through the village, and Clara saw how they lived. They used fire, but carefully small, controlled flames for warmth and cooking. They had tools carved from stone and bone. They wore simple garments woven from plant fibers. And everywhere, that same glowing ice provided light. But the signs of disaster were everywhere. Fresh cracks scarred the walls. Several shelters had been abandoned, crushed under fallen debris. And the mechanical pounding from above was constant now, rattling through Clara's bones. Kale brought her to the far edge of the cavern, where a group of adult males stood guard near a collapsed section of tunnel. The ceiling there had partially caved in, and through the gap, Clara could hear voices. Human voices. She crept closer, climbing carefully over the rubble. Through a narrow opening, she could see artificial light, harsh and electric, so different from the gentle glow of the cavern. She heard the whir of drills, the beep of machinery, and men shouting to each other over the noise. Hit another pocket. Sensor says the mineral deposit extends another 100 feet down. Don't care what environmental said. We're behind schedule. Just keep drilling. Clara's blood ran cold. She turned to Kale. They don't know you're here. They have no idea. Kale nodded grimly. He gestured to the damaged ceiling, to his people huddled in their diminishing sanctuary, to the children playing too close to the dangerous cracks. Then he showed her his side, the wound she'd stitched, nearly healed now but still visible. You got that fighting them, Clara said. You tried to stop them. Kale made a sound that didn't need translation. Sadness, frustration, fear. The elder approached again, moving with urgency. She took Clara's hand and led her to one of the pools. In the clear water, Clara could see veins of crystal running through the rock, beautiful minerals that glowed with their own inner light. The elder pointed to the crystals, then to Kale's healing wound, then to Clara's own hands, chapped and red from the cold. She cupped water in her palm and offered it to Clara. Clara drank. The water was warm and tasted faintly sweet, like honey and minerals. And immediately, the pain in her frost-damaged fingers began to ease. The redness faded, the skin healing before her eyes. The water heals, Clara whispered. The crystals, that's what they're after. Not just minerals. Something that can heal. The elder nodded slowly. She gestured to her people, to the children, to the injured, to the old ones warming themselves by the springs. This water sustained them. Without it, they would die. And the mining company was about to destroy it all. Clara looked at Kale. How long before the cavern collapses? Kale held up his hand, fingers spread. 5 days, maybe less. Can you relocate? Find another cave. The elder made a sound, harsh and final. She gestured to the children, to the elders too frail to travel, to the complex network of tunnels they'd carved over generations. This is our home. We cannot leave in time. Clara felt the weight of it crushing down on her. She was one human woman standing in an impossible situation. What could she possibly do against a mining corporation with money, machinery, and the law on their side? But then she thought about the bowl of stew she'd left on her porch 3 years ago. A small act of kindness that had led to this moment. Sometimes small acts started big changes. I need proof, Clara said. If I'm going to stop them, I need evidence that you're here, that this place exists. But, she looked at Cale, at the elder, at the faces watching her with desperate hope. I won't expose you. I'll find another way. Cale tilted his head, considering. Then he led her to another tunnel, this one leading upward. They climbed for 20 minutes until they reached a narrow opening that looked out over the mountain. Below them, carved into the forest, was the mining site. Dozens of vehicles, prefabricated buildings, industrial equipment, and armed security guards patrolling the perimeter. Clara pulled out her phone, no signal of course, but the camera still worked. She took photos of everything. The equipment, the excavation site, the proximity to protected forest land. But it wasn't enough. She needed something that would force an immediate shutdown. I have to get closer, she said. I have to get inside. Cale gripped her shoulder, his expression fierce. Dangerous. I know, Clara said. But what choice do we have? She looked back toward the cavern, thinking of the children playing by the water, the elders warming themselves by the fire, an entire hidden world on the brink of extinction. Some things were worth the risk. Clara spent 2 days gathering evidence. She hiked back to her cabin alone. Cale couldn't risk being seen, and drove her battered pickup truck to the nearest town 40 miles down the mountain. The ranger station sat on Main Street, a small brick building with a faded parks and wildlife sign. Deputy Ranger Marcus Webb looked up from his paperwork when she walked in. They'd met a few times over the years. He'd helped her once when a bear got into her shed. Clara? Everything okay up at your place? There's illegal mining happening on the north face, she said, sliding her phone across his desk. Protected land. They're blasting into the mountain, and it's causing structural damage to the cave systems underneath. Webb scrolled through her photos, his expression darkening. Talbot Mining. They have permits for mineral surveys, but nothing like this. He looked up. How'd you get these photos? I hike. I pay attention. He studied her for a long moment. I'll call the regional office. This'll take a few days to process, but if what you're saying is true. Days? Clara's voice rose. The caves could collapse any time. There's geothermal activity down there, unique ecosystems. I understand, but there's a process. I can't just shut down a corporate operation without proper authorization. Clara left the station feeling the walls closing in. She tried calling the EPA, the Forest Service, even a local environmental group. Everyone said the same thing. File a report, wait for investigation, follow the process. But Cale's people didn't have time for process. That night, a black SUV was parked outside her cabin when she got home. Clara's hand moved to the knife in her coat pocket as 2 men in suits emerged. The shorter one wore expensive sunglasses despite the twilight. The taller one had the build of someone who'd done more than sit behind a desk. Ms. Hartley? The shorter one said. I'm David Reese, legal counsel for Talbot Mining. We understand you've been making some concerning allegations. Not allegations. Facts. Our operation is fully permitted, and we take environmental concerns seriously, which is why we're here to personally assure you that you're drilling into protected cave systems. Clara interrupted. I have photos. Reese's smile didn't reach his eyes. Photos taken on private company land. Technically, that's trespassing. We could press charges. The taller man stepped forward. Be smart about this, Ms. Hartley. You live alone up here. Long way from help if something happened. Animals, avalanches. Mountains are dangerous. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Are we done? Clara asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Reese handed her a business card. Think carefully about your next steps. Some battles aren't worth fighting. They left, but Clara saw the SUV parked at the bottom of her access road for the next 3 hours. She called Webb again. They threatened me. Did they explicitly threaten you? They implied. Then it's your word against a corporation's legal team, he sighed. Clara, I believe you, but you need to be careful. These people have resources. After she hung up, Clara sat by her window and watched the SUV finally drive away. Her hands were shaking. This was bigger than she'd thought. Talbot Mining wasn't just some small operation. They had money, lawyers, and people willing to intimidate a woman living alone in the mountains. But they didn't know about Kale. They didn't know what they were destroying. And they definitely didn't know how stubborn she could be. The next morning, Clara noticed her truck had a flat tire. When she changed it, she found a clean puncture, deliberate. Her landline started clicking whenever she made calls. And twice, she saw vehicles she didn't recognize slowly driving past her property. They were watching her. At night, Kale emerged from the forest. He'd seen the men, sensed the danger. His expression was fierce, protective, but also conflicted. Clara showed him the business card. "They want me to stop. They're trying to scare me." Kale made a low growl, his hands clenching into fists. "I won't stop," Clara said. "But I need real evidence. Something they can't deny or cover up." She pulled out a map of the mountain and pointed to the mining site. "I need to get inside, see what they're really doing. Record it." Kale shook his head violently, pointing at her, then making a braking motion. "They'll hurt you. Maybe. But if I don't try, they'll definitely hurt your people." For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then Kale touched his chest, then hers. Together. "No," Clara said. "If they see you." Kale cut her off with a sharp sound. He'd made his decision. He pointed at the map, then at himself, then at Clara. "I protect you, like you protected me." Clara felt tears sting her eyes. This creature, this supposedly mindless beast according to every legend and story, was willing to risk everything for his people and for her. "Okay," she whispered. Together, they planned for 2 days, watching the mining site from the ridge, learning the security patterns, finding the weak points. The operation ran around the clock, but the graveyard shift was smaller, only 3 guards and a skeleton crew. That's when they'd go in. Clara packed her camera, a flashlight, and Thomas's knife. Kale waited in the shadows, his amber eyes glowing in the darkness. As they moved toward the mining site under cover of night, Clara thought about what Thomas used to say. Sometimes doing the right thing means doing the scary thing. She just hoped they'd both survive what came next. The mining site looked like a wound carved into the mountain. Clara and Kale crouched in the tree-line at 2 in the morning, watching the skeleton crew move between the prefab buildings. 3 guards patrolled the perimeter with flashlights, their breath fogging in the freezing air. Beyond them, the excavation pit glowed with halogen work lights. "We need to get to that main shaft," Clara whispered, pointing to the largest drilling structure. "That's where they're storing the core samples and documentation." Kale nodded. He'd wrapped his fur in dark mud to avoid reflecting light, making him nearly invisible in the shadows. He touched Clara's shoulder and pointed. A guard was walking away from the east fence, leaving it temporarily unwatched. They moved. Clara's heart hammered as they crossed the open ground and slipped under the chain-link fence where Kale had bent it earlier. They pressed against a storage container, listening. Machinery hummed. Men's voices drifted from the heated office trailer. Kale led the way, using the equipment as cover. They reached the main drilling platform, a massive structure suspended over the excavation shaft. Metal stairs led up to a control room where Clara could see computer monitors glowing through the windows. She started climbing. The stairs creaked under her weight, each sound impossibly loud. Clara reached the control room and tried the door, unlocked. Inside, banks of monitors showed drilling depth, mineral analysis, structural scans of the cave systems below. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone and started recording. The screens showed everything. Geological surveys proving they knew about the caverns, internal memos discussing acceptable collapse risks, and mineral analysis showing the healing properties of the crystals. They knew exactly what they were destroying, and they'd calculated it was worth it. Clara photographed documents, emails, drilling schedules, evidence that would bury them. Then she saw it. On the largest monitor, a timer counting down. 53 minutes until the next scheduled blast. And this one was massive, enough explosive to crack through the remaining rock layer and reach the crystal deposits. Enough to collapse the entire cavern system. No, Clara, breathe. No. The door burst open. A security guard stood there, radio in one hand, flashlight in the other. "The hell are you?" Cale's massive hand grabbed him from behind, lifting him off his feet and tossing him gently but firmly onto a pile of equipment padding. The man lay stunned, gasping. "Go!" Cale rumbled. Clara ran, but alarms were already blaring. Lights flooded the site. Men were shouting, running toward them. Cale grabbed Clara and vaulted over the platform railing, dropping 20 feet to the ground below. He absorbed the impact, keeping her safe, then sprinted toward the fence. Gunshots cracked through the air. Clara felt Cale flinch, stumble, but he kept running. They crashed through the fence and into the forest as more shots echoed behind them. Men with rifles poured from the buildings, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. "The caves!" Clara gasped. "They're going to blast in less than an hour." Cale changed direction, pulling her deeper into the mountain instead of toward safety. They had to warn his people, had to get them out before the explosion. The forest became a maze of shadows and adrenaline. Clara's lungs burned. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. Engines, shouts, dogs barking. They reached the hidden passage, and Cale drummed the sequence. The rock face opened, and they plunged inside. The glowing tunnels stretched ahead. Cale was limping now. He'd been hit in the leg, but he pushed forward with desperate strength. Clara could hear it already. The mechanical whine of drilling, closer than before, and beneath it, the ominous creak of stone under impossible pressure. They burst into the cavern. The village was in chaos. The elders had felt the vibrations, knew something was wrong. Cale roared, a sound that shook the walls, and his people turned as one. He made urgent gestures, pointing upward, making braking motions. The elder female understood immediately. She began calling out in those deep, resonant tones, and the entire village mobilized. Parents grabbed children. The young helped the elderly. In minutes, they were moving, a desperate exodus through the tunnels leading away from the blast zone. But not everyone would make it in time. The ceiling groaned. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ice. Clara heard it then, the muffled thump of explosives detonating somewhere above. The mountain screamed. A section of ceiling collapsed, crushing one of the pools. Water and steam erupted, and several of Cale's people were cut off, trapped on the far side of the cavern. Cale didn't hesitate. He ran back, his wounded leg trailing blood, and began hauling away debris with his bare hands. Clara joined him, her human strength pathetic compared to his, but every stone counting. They pulled 2 younglings through, then an injured elder. Another explosion. Closer. "Cale, we have to go!" Clara screamed. But he was staring at something else, the human voices now inside the tunnels. The mining crew had followed them through the passage. 5 men with rifles emerged into the cavern, their headlamps sweeping across the impossible scene. They saw the village, the glowing ice, the creatures helping each other flee. What in the hell? The final explosion detonated. The world became thunder and falling stone. Clara felt Cale's arms wrap around her as the mountain came down. They were running, but the tunnel ahead was collapsing, sealing them in. Then Cale threw her. She flew through the air and crashed onto solid ground beyond the collapse. When she looked back, Cale was on the other side of a wall of fallen rock, his amber eyes meeting hers one last time. "No!" Clara screamed, clawing at the stones. But the mountain had already taken him. Clara dug until her fingers bled. She tore at the rocks with her bare hands, screaming Cale's name until her voice gave out. Behind the collapse, she could hear nothing. No movement, no sound, only the settling silence of tons of stone. The elder female found her there 3 hours later, still digging, still refusing to believe. The old one placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder and made a soft, mournful sound. Then she pointed toward the remaining tunnel, where the rest of Cale's people waited in the darkness. "We must go, before more comes down." Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to dig until she found him. But the mountain was still groaning, still threatening to collapse further. She let the elder lead her away. They traveled for hours through emergency tunnels Clara hadn't known existed, eventually emerging on the far side of the mountain range. Dawn was breaking, painting the snow gold and pink. The village gathered in a hidden valley, taking stock of who'd survived. Nearly everyone had made it, parents clutching children, elders helping the injured. But 3 were missing, trapped or killed in the collapse. One of them was Kale. The elder approached Clara, carrying something wrapped in woven cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a crystal, the size of Clara's fist, glowing with that same ethereal blue-green light from the healing pools. She pressed it into Clara's hands. Clara looked down at the crystal, then at her phone, miraculously intact in her pocket, full of evidence, the photos and videos she'd risked everything to capture. "I'll make them pay," she whispered. "I promise." The elder touched her forehead to Clara's, the same gesture Kale had made, and Clara felt the weight of trust, of hope, of an entire species depending on her voice. Then, like ghosts, Kale's people melted into the forest. Clara stood alone in the snow, watching them disappear, carrying their entire civilization on their backs to some new hiding place where humans wouldn't find them. She hoped they'd make it. She hoped they'd survive. But first, she had work to do. The story broke 3 days later. Clara released everything to an investigative journalist she'd found through an environmental organization. The photos, the videos, the internal documents showing Talbot Mining knew about the caves and chose profit over preservation. The footage of the cavern, carefully edited to show the damage without revealing Kale's people, went viral within hours. Public outrage was immediate and overwhelming. Environmental groups filed emergency injunctions. Federal regulators descended on the site. Within a week, Talbot Mining's operations were suspended, pending a full investigation. Within a month, the executives were facing criminal charges for environmental destruction and violations of protected land treaties. Clara testified at every hearing, spoke at every rally, gave interviews to anyone who would listen. She became the face of a movement, the woman who'd stood against a corporation and won. But late at night, alone in her cabin, she grieved. She grieved for Kale, who'd saved her life with his last act. She grieved for the trust he'd shown her, for the friendship that had grown between 2 impossible beings. She grieved for all the conversations they'd never have, all the winters he wouldn't return to her porch for stew. Winter came again. Clara stood on her porch on the first night of snowfall, holding a bowl of venison stew. She placed it on the top step, knowing no one would come for it, knowing Kale was gone. But she left it anyway, just in case. She turned to go inside and stopped. In the snow, just beyond the tree-line, something glowed. Clara's heart seized. She climbed down from the porch and walked toward it, her breath catching. It was a crystal, larger than the one the elder had given her, shaped like a teardrop, pulsing with soft light. And beside it, carved into the bark of a pine tree, was a symbol, the same one she'd seen in the painted tunnels. She picked up the crystal, and warmth flooded through her hands. The frostbite that had been forming on her fingers, she'd been spending so much time outdoors at rallies and protests, vanished instantly. The exhaustion weighing on her bones lifted. She felt stronger, clearer, more alive than she had in months. Below the symbol were fresh marks in the bark. For those who protect life, life will protect them. Clara pressed her hand against the carving, tears streaming down her face. They'd survived. Kale's people had relocated, had found safety, and they were thanking her. And Kale. She looked at the crystal, glowing in her palm like a piece of captured starlight, and she knew. He'd made it. Somehow, impossibly, he'd survived the collapse. And he'd left this for her, this gift of healing and hope. "Thank you," she whispered to the forest. "Thank you for trusting me." The wind carried her words into the mountains, and somewhere far away, she felt more than heard it, that deep rhythmic drumming, a heartbeat in the earth answering her own. Clara never saw Kale again, but every winter, she left food at the tree-line. And every winter, she found small gifts in return. Crystals, carved stones, woven grasses that never wilted. Reminders that she wasn't alone. that somewhere in the hidden places of the world, ancient things still survived. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the snow fell soft and thick, Clara would place her hand against the frozen ground and feel it, the pulse of the mountains, the drumming of a people who endured, the heartbeat of a friendship that transcended species. She'd become their voice in the human world, their guardian as Kale had once been hers, and she would never stop fighting for them.